The air inside the arena had become thick, almost gelatinous, hanging heavy over 20,000 exhausted souls. It was the kind of humidity that exists only in the dying moments of a main event. A mixture of sweat, spilled beer, and the collective anxiety of a crowd realizing the ending they wanted wasn't coming. In the ring, the current champion stood tall, picture of arrogant dominance, wiping a smear of her opponent's blood from her cheek. The referee's hand was raised for the 3 count, hovering in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. The audience had resigned themselves to the inevitable, their boos sounding tired, lacking the vitriol of the opening bell. It was a standard, predictable defense, a match designed to solidify a reign that had grown stale and suffocating. The commentary team was already wrapping up their talking points, searching for synonyms for dominance and unstoppable, their voices droning into the monitors with the rhythmic predictability of a metronome. Then, the rhythm broke. It wasn't a glitch in the Titantron, or a sudden explosion of pyrotechnics that signaled the shift. It was a sudden, violent absence of sound. The hum of the arena speakers cut out completely. The ambient noise of the air conditioning units died. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wet slap of the champion's boots on the canvas as she shifted her weight, confused. The referee stopped his count, his hand trembling in the sudden void. This was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a vacuum, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the building. The crowd, sensing something unscripted, ceased their murmuring. 20,000 people froze in unison, their eyes darting from the darkened stage to the production area, looking for a sign of technical failure. But the darkness wasn't technical, it was atmospheric. The lights didn't just go out. They seemed to retreat, dimming slowly in concentric circles until only the ring remained illuminated, a lonely island in a sea of black. The champion's expression shifted from arrogance to a primal, instinctive unease. She backed into the ropes, squinting into the abyss of the entrance ramp. The silence stretched, becoming physically uncomfortable, a tension that tightened the chest and made breathing difficult. There was no music, no familiar guitar riff or orchestrated drum beat to tell the fans how to feel. There was only the sound of a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a heartbeat amplified through the floorboards, vibrating through the soles of everyone's shoes. It was a frequency more felt than heard, a subsonic dread that signaled something ancient was approaching. The commentators remained silent, their headsets likely filled with chaos from the production truck, but on air, they said nothing. To speak would be to break the spell, and they, like the fans, were paralyzed by the uncertainty. This wasn't part of the run sheet. This wasn't the scheduled interference. The atmosphere curdled, turning from confusion to genuine apprehension. Fans in the front row stopped recording with their phones, lowering them slowly as the realization hit that they were no longer watching a show. They were witnessing an intrusion. The air grew colder, the artificial climate control seemingly failing against a chill that radiated from the stage. The champion in the ring looked toward the entrance, her bravado stripping away to reveal the terrified young woman beneath the character. She knew that rhythm. She knew that silence. And for the first time in her reign, she looked small. From the deepest shadow of the entrance tunnel, a figure emerged. Not with the pomp and circumstance of a superstar, but with the slow, deliberate cadence of an executioner. There were no flashing strobes to guide her path, only a single stark white spotlight that snapped on, pinning her against the darkness.
I'll take that.
The gasp that tore through the arena wasn't a cheer. It was a collective intake of breath, a sound of disbelief bordering on horror. It was her. But it wasn't the version of her they remembered. The gear was different, stripped of the colors and branding that had once sold millions in merchandise. It was utilitarian, dark and weathered, like armor worn through a long, losing war. She didn't play to the crowd. She didn't look at the hard camera. She simply walked, her eyes locked on the ring with a predatory intensity that made the distance between the ramp and the ropes feel terrifyingly short. The crowd's reaction was a fractured, chaotic noise. Pockets of people were screaming her name, but the majority stood in stunned silence, hands over their mouths, trying to process the ghost walking before them. The commentary team finally broke their silence, but their voices lacked the polished hype of television. They sounded shaken, their words stumbling over one another as they tried to verify what their eyes were seeing. One commentator, usually the voice of cynicism, whispered a name that hadn't been spoken on broadcast in years, his tone trembling with a mix of reverence and fear. He noted the scars on her arms, the way she carried her shoulder, the utter lack of joy in her return. This wasn't a reunion tour, it was a reckoning. As she reached the steel steps, the silence returned, heavier than before. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, but her expression didn't soften. There was no smile, no acknowledgement of the welcome-back chants that were tentatively starting to ripple through the upper decks. She looked at them with a cold, detached judgment, as if the audience were complicit in whatever crimes had kept her away. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the lines of exhaustion and the hardness in her eyes. It was a face that had seen the other side of the business, the side that breaks people, and had come back not to play the game, but to end it. The current champion, trapped inside the ropes, looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. She clutched her title belt, not as a prize, but as a shield. The intruder climbed the steps, the metal groaning under the weight of the moment. She didn't vault over the ropes. She stepped through them, dismantling the barrier between the past and the present. The referee, realizing he was utterly obsolete in this equation, backed away into the corner, making himself small. The two women stood across from each other, the polished, corporate-chosen face of the new era and the scarred, dangerous relic of the old. The tension in the ring was palpable, a live wire snapping with energy. The audience dared not cheer now. The violence in the air was too real. It felt less like a wrestling match and more like a domestic invasion. The invader tilted her head, observing the champion, and for the first time a sound escaped her, a low, mocking laugh that was picked up by the ring microphones, chilling the blood of everyone listening. The physical confrontation did not begin with a lockup or a flurry of strikes. It began with a psychological dissection. The returnee simply stepped forward, invading the champion's personal space with a fearlessness that bordered on disrespect. The champion, usually the aggressor, flinched. That single involuntary movement told the entire story. The hierarchy had been reset without a single blow being thrown. The invader reached out, her hand moving slowly, and placed a palm against the champion's forehead. It was a gesture of dismissal, a parent disciplining a petulant child. The champion, fueled by humiliation, finally snapped. She swung a desperate looping right hand, but the returnee didn't even block it. She slipped inside the guard, absorbing the impact on her shoulder with barely a grimace, and drove her own forehead into the bridge of the champion's nose. The sound of the headbutt cracked through the arena like a gunshot. Champion crumbled, clutching her face, her dominance shattering instantly. This wasn't the stylized combat the fans were used to. It was ugly, efficient, and brutal. Returnee didn't run the ropes or play to the gallery. She methodically picked the champion apart, joint by joint. Every slam was punctuated by a grimace of effort, showing that while she was dominant, she was also in pain, that every move cost her something. This added a layer of tragedy to the violence. She wasn't a superhero. She was a damaged machine running on spite. The crowd watched in a hush, the scattered cheers dying out as they realized they were watching a beatdown, not a match. The commentary team stopped calling moves and started pleading for officials to intervene, their voices losing the veneer of kayfabe and dipping into genuine concern. When the champion tried to crawl toward the ropes, seeking escape, the returnee simply stepped on her hand, grinding her boot into the fingers. She looked down at the gold belt lying on the canvas, the symbol of the company's excellence, and kicked it away with contempt. This was the moment the audience realized her target wasn't the woman, it was the institution. She grabbed the champion by the hair, pulling her up to a kneeling position, forcing her to look into the camera. The returnee leaned in close, whispering something that the microphones couldn't catch, but the camera caught the champion's eyes widening in absolute terror. It was a message that stripped away the character and addressed the person beneath. The finish was mercifully quick, but narratively devastating. She didn't use her old finishing move, the one the fans were waiting to pop for. Instead, she locked in a submission hold that looked uncomfortable and amateur, a choke that was less about wrestling technique and more about suffocation. The champion tapped out almost immediately, but the hold wasn't released. The bell rang frantically, echoing over and over, but the grip tightened. Security guards flooded the ring, but they hesitated, terrified to touch her. Finally, she released the hold on her own terms, standing up and looking at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. She didn't raise her arms in victory. She simply turned and walked away, leaving the broken body of the champion and the confused silence of the fans in her wake. Backstage, the atmosphere was not one of celebration or high fives. The gorilla position, the nerve center of the production just behind the curtain, was a scene of organized panic. Producers were screaming into headsets, trying to cut feeds or get medical personnel to the ring, but the camera followed the returnee as she walked through the curtain. She didn't stop to acknowledge the shocked faces of the executives or the wrestlers huddled around monitors. The locker room, usually a place of camaraderie or staged conflict, felt like a funeral home. Current stars, men and women who had built their reputations in her absence, pressed their backs against the concrete walls to let her pass, their eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and intimidation. The hierarchy of the locker room had been decimated in 15 minutes. The camera tracked her into a private hallway, away from the noise. Here, the facade cracked slightly. She leaned against a wall, sliding down until she was crouching, clutching her ribs. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the reality of what she had just done. We saw the trembling in her hands, the heavy, ragged breathing of a woman who had pushed her body past its limits. This humanized the monster we had just seen in the ring. It wasn't effortless, it was agony. A producer approached her tentatively, a man who had known her before she left, asking if she was okay. She looked up, her eyes hollow, and said nothing. The silence between them spoke of bridges burned and trust broken. Meanwhile, the digital world was burning. Social media trends were dominated by her name, but the sentiment was divided. Half the fan base was euphoric, blinded by nostalgia. The other half was horrified by the brutality, questioning if the company had gone too far. The blurred lines between script and reality were causing arguments, conspiracy theories, and genuine concern for the former champion's health. The network executives were shown in a blurred background shot, arguing heatedly, cell phones glued to their ears. This wasn't just a plot twist, it was a liability. The narrative was spinning out of control, exactly as she had intended. The lingering shot of Chapter 4 focused on the locker room of the deposed champion. The door was open slightly. Inside, we heard sobbing, not the theatrical crying of a character who lost a match, but the jagged, ugly crying of someone who had been humiliated. The returner walked past this door, pausing for a fraction of a second. She didn't enter. She didn't apologize. She hardened her expression, adjusted her gear, and kept walking toward the exit. The message was clear. The era of everyone gets a participation trophy was over. The sharks were back in the water, and the water was full of blood. The final chapter didn't take place in the arena, but in the sterile, quiet environment of a post-show interview set filmed hours later. The adrenaline had completely worn off. The returnee sat on a folding chair, an ice pack taped to her shoulder, a fresh cut stitched over her eye. The interviewer, visibly nervous, asked the question everyone wanted to know. Why now? I'd like that. Camera held on her face for a long, uncomfortable time before she answered. She didn't cut a promo. She didn't shout catchphrases. She spoke in a low, gravelly voice that sounded like gravel grinding on glass. She explained that she didn't come back for the fans. She looked directly into the lens, breaking the fourth wall with chilling precision, and told the audience that their cheers meant nothing to her anymore. She recalled the day she left, how the same people cheering her return today were the ones who cannibalized her career years ago, demanding more blood, more risk, until she broke. She wasn't back to save the industry. She was back to mirror its ugliness. She was the ghost of their own gluttony. You didn't want a wrestler, she whispered. You wanted a tragedy. The twist was the realization that she was not the hero of this story. The video cut to montages of the young roster, the hopefuls, the dreamers looking at monitors with fear. The returnee wasn't there to pass the torch. She was there to extinguish it because she believed the fire had burned out long ago. She admitted that she hated who she had to become to survive, but she hated the system that created her even more. She stood up, leaving the interview unfinished, the microphone dangling by its cord. The screen faded to black, but not before a final. Lingering image, the championship belt, retrieved from the ring, sitting on a trash can in the hallway, discarded and irrelevant.
Ow.
The text on the screen didn't ask what's next.
Ow.
It simply stated, "Be careful what you wish for." The video ended in silence, leaving the viewer with a heavy, sinking feeling in their gut. The excitement of the return had been replaced by a profound sense of guilt. We wanted her back, but we didn't ask what version of her would return, or what price would be paid for our entertainment. The arena was silent, and now, so were we.